Imagine a vast American region stretching across northern and western Minnesota. Winters so quiet the silence itself feels heavy. The wind against rusted steel, endless plains, and roads where engines roar only rarely. Visual, aerial sweep, snowdrifts, empty main streets. Why does this place matter? And why does it feel so empty? Fewer than 15 out of every 100 residents even remain. It takes up nearly half the state, yet the towns grow smaller as Minneapolis and St. Paul draw away new generations. For all its iron and forests, for all its ingenuity and grit, the story of this land is written in bone-deep cold, in the songs of the first stewards, and in the machines that made modern agriculture possible. The choices made here are not small. They are American choices, and they force a larger question. What does leaving so much land behind reveal about the American dream? And what comes next for this vast, quiet place? Northern Minnesota begins as a world of water and woods. Here, the land is stitched with thousands of lakes, their surfaces frozen hard for half the year. Black spruce and jack pine forests press close, their needles dusted in rime as long nights deepen. In winter, snow stacks higher than fence posts. The cold settles into everything: iron, timber, even the bones of old farmhouses. Spring arrives late, and when it does, the thaw releases the scent of rust and wet earth. Just beyond the tree line, the country changes. The forests thin, and the world opens into a horizon of rolling prairie. Western Minnesota stretches flat and broad, a patchwork of grain fields and wild grass that runs to the edge of sight. This is the Red River Valley, where the soil is dark and rich, but the growing season is short. Only a few months stand between the last frost and the first snow, and every harvest is a race against the cold. Towns here are few and far between. Some have fewer than 400 people, and the distance between neighbors can be measured in miles rather than blocks. The land itself feels endless. In the north, lakes and forests swallow sound, broken only by the call of a loon or the distant growl of a snowmobile. To the west, the wind sweeps across wheat and sugar beet fields, carrying the metallic tang of old machinery left to weather out in the open. Rusted steel and the memory of roaring engines hang in the air. The horizon moves with wind and grain. There are no great cities in this zone. No skylines break the line of the plains or the forest. The emptiness is not just a matter of numbers. It is a physical presence, shaped by deep winters and the restless sky. This is a land built on endurance, where nature sets the terms of every season. Its vastness holds stories of those who stayed, and of many more who chose to leave. What would you do with a land so vast, so spare, that centuries move through it like weather, not like ownership? Wide aerial over misty lakes, a lone canoe, wind in tall pines, rusted combine left to sleep. Long before the steel of the combine and the grid of county roads, this land answered to different rhythms. The Ojibwe people, moving with the seasons, shaped their lives around lakes, rivers, and forests. Their presence was measured not by fences or acre counts, but by stories carried through generations and by careful returns to shallows where wild rice grew thick each autumn. The land was never a blank slate. It was a living memory, a relative to be respected rather than a commodity to be divided. In that world, population stayed low by design. Cycles of hunting, fishing, and gathering called for movement, not permanence. Villages rose near the rice lakes in late summer, then scattered as winter pressed in. The forests and waters provided, but only when treated with restraint. Elders spoke of land that held its own power. This land holds our stories, not room for endless towns, one Leech Lake elder recalled. Settlement meant something else, not rows of houses, not endless fields, but a pattern of return, a promise to leave enough for those who would follow. Treaties signed in the 19th century acknowledged these older ways, and for a time they preserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather. Yet railroads and surveyors pressed in from the south, bringing maps, lines, and new ideas about use. Even so, the land itself remained thinly peopled, shaped by a philosophy that prized stewardship over unlimited expansion. The forests and prairies were not meant to be filled up. For the Ojibwe and the Dakota, the vastness of northern and western Minnesota was not a challenge to conquer. It was a gift to tend. The emptiness here is not an accident of climate or economics. It is a legacy of respect, carried forward by those who still return to the lakes each fall, and who remember the stories written into river bends and marshes. Close shot, an elder gathering wild rice, water glinting, hands steady and sure. Listen to that ethic and you hear a different kind of planning, a different kind of promise. The Creator gave these lands to be protected for 7 generations, from the lakes of Leech to the prairies of the West. That pledge shaped choices about where homes would rise and where forests would stand. Today, the landscape still holds its quiet. Machines roar in distant fields, and steel and rust mark the edges of towns, but much of the region remains a place where people come and go with the seasons, where memory guides use as much as need. The question for the future is simple and profound. Slow fade to map of Minnesota, light settling on the north and the west. Can the American dream, with its promise of growth and permanence, find room alongside a tradition of restraint and care? Or will this vast, quiet country ask us to redefine what prosperity really means? Legacy and investment, stewardship and ambition. Who will choose the next chapter for this land? Electric lines first snaked across these plains in the depths of the Great Depression. In the 30s, the promise of light and power arrived not from the cities, but from local hands, neighbors pooling money and sweat into rural cooperatives. By the time the war ended, the darkened farmsteads of Beltrami and Polk counties glowed against the night. Where only a handful of farms had electricity in 1940, nearly 4 out of 5 did by the end of the next decade. The hum of new motors replaced the silence of hand tools. Harvests changed forever. In the Red River Valley, stories still pass down about the year the first self-propelled combine rolled off a railcar near Fertile. One machine, all steel and roaring gears, cut a swath through fields that once demanded a dozen men with scythes and sweat. By the 50s, families that had survived on muscle alone watched as a single operator finished the work of 10. Wheat yields soared from 10 to over 20 bushels an acre, and the region's sugar beet and navy bean crops filled railcars headed for distant cities. On these endless plains, a handful of farms fed millions. Output rivaled the annual harvests of entire small countries. Yet the marvel of mechanization carried a quiet cost. As the combines grew larger and the fields stretched further, the need for hired hands shrank. Children who once walked behind their parents at planting time packed up for Minneapolis or Fargo looking for work the machines had replaced. Main streets emptied, and schoolhouses closed their doors for the last time. Still, the memory of those first electrified nights and the thunder of the first harvest machines remains vivid. One farmer, his hands rough from decades in the fields, recalls, "When that combine came, it was like seeing the future, but it meant my brothers left, and only I stayed." The scale of American ingenuity here is measured not just in acres or bushels, but in the echo it left across the land, progress that fed a nation, even as it hollowed out its own heartland. Why do vast swaths of land in northern and western Minnesota hold so few Americans? Imagine endless plains, rusted silos and battered steel, snow pressing against a long, quiet road, the distant roar of an engine heading south. The Twin Cities act like a magnet, pulling people toward jobs, colleges, and world-class hospitals, and leaving wide horizons nearly empty. Wide aerial shot of empty towns, a long highway leading to a distant city. Geography explains part of the story. This is a land of flat glaciated prairie and scattered lakes, deep winters that feel endless, and rich soils that rewarded mechanized farming. Fields grew wider, farms grew larger, and fewer hands were needed to harvest the same acreage. Small towns stayed small because the land itself favored big machines over big populations. The result is a vast rural footprint, spread thin across thousands of square miles, with only a handful of large urban centers. In the middle of the 20th century, 3 forces reshaped everything. World War II accelerated industrial-scale agriculture, new highways made distance easier to cross, and jobs and services clustered near cities. Men and women left for factories, universities, and hospitals in Minneapolis and St. Paul. That era was an inflection point, where population patterns became self-reinforcing. By the time the region matured, the Twin Cities had become an economic engine, attracting more than half of the state's population and concentrating companies, hospitals, and universities that drew talent and capital. The metro's economy grew so large it resembled the economic profile of some small nations. Talent and investment flowed to the city, and the scale of that concentration made the metro's gravitational pull almost impossible to resist. But the boom left deep gaps. Broadband maps tell their own story. In Kitson and Marshall counties, nearly half of homes still struggle with slow or unreliable internet. In the town of Ortonville, businesses have waited years for the high-speed fiber that many suburban neighborhoods take for granted. Without reliable connectivity, telework and online learning remain out of reach for many, and opportunity stays unequal. This is an ambition gap as much as an infrastructure gap. Still, transformation is underway across the plains. Wind turbines rise along the horizon, their blades turning above fields that once only grew wheat. Rural cooperatives formed over the last 20 years now own hundreds of megawatts of wind power, and those projects return millions in tax revenue and lease payments to local members. These dollars, and the jobs that come with them, sketch a new rural economy wired to the land and the sky, close on a rusted school bell, then a new turbine blade turning on the horizon. The question lingers, can these winds of change pull people back against the gravity of the cities? Can fiber and turbines, remote work and small-town ingenuity recreate the density of services that once drew families south? Or will northern and western Minnesota remain a vast story of endurance, written in steel and wind and open sky, and lived out by ever fewer hands? Today, half of Minnesota's land holds barely a whisper of its people, while over half the state crowds into one metropolitan area. As rural roots thin, and the rust of empty silos whispers across endless plains, questions about opportunity and heritage grow louder. The American landscape is vast, and the future of that landscape depends on who chooses to remain. Share your thoughts below.